It's Wednesday, the 11th December 2024. Let's take a look at the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. First, the Punch newspaper. The leading story: 2027 presidency. Atiku, Obi alliance can't unseat Tinubu, declares APC. You can read that on page 2 of the newspaper. And above the leading story by the right, tax reform. Reds may resume debate as Southern Caucus prepares for talks. You can read that on page 2 of the newspaper. And below the leading story by the left, Judge remands Yahaya Bello. Lawyers plan fresh bail application. You can read that on page 7 of the newspaper. Federal government to sanction airlines over delayed ticket refund. You can read that on page 27 of the newspaper. Taraba governor's sister allegedly shot by police escort dies. You can read that on page 14 of the newspaper. Farotimi, police allege witness intimidation, oppose bail application. You can read that on page 7 of the newspaper. Relocation dispute. Federal government cancels 64 billion naira Osun Airport approval. You can read that on page 27 of the newspaper. I'm moving over to the next paper, Daily Trust. The leading story: Reps ask CBN to address cash crunch. You can read that on page 4 of the newspaper. And below the leading story, ECOWAS may formalize Burkina Faso. Mali, Niger exit. You can read that on page 5 of the newspaper. Police recover fake $3.3 million, 51.9 million CFA, 1.4 million naira in Kano. You can read that on page 8 of the newspaper. Rights Commission received 2 million violation complaints annually. You can read that on page 3 of the newspaper. Nigeria far from fighting institutional corruption, says Wema Bank. You can read that on page 6 of the newspaper. And moving over to the next paper, The Guardian. The leading story: cash scarcity worsen as banks upgraded digital platforms falter. You can read that on page 6 of the newspaper. And below the leading story by the right, court remands Yahaya Bello in Kuje pending bail application. You can read that on page 5 of the newspaper. ASUU strike, students suspend planned protest, issue 48-hour ultimatum. You can read that on page 29 of the newspaper. Cybercrime law, defamation now weapons of persecution. NGE says Serap. You can read that on page 3 of the newspaper. Consumers neck kick as Disco pushes for 240 kilowatts tariff. You can read that on page 3 of the newspaper. Federal government suspend energy tariff review as 4-month subsidy hits 768.68 billion naira. You can read that on page 15 of the newspaper. Tax reforms. Southern Rep backs Tinubu as stakeholders clash over VAT hike. Economic impact. You can read that on page 6 of the newspaper. Tinubu commits to delivering promises, louds Interior Minister. You can read that on page 3 of the newspaper. I'm moving over to the next paper, Vanguard. The leading story: Nigerians groan as cash scarcity compounds hardship. You can read that on page 14 of the newspaper. And above the leading story, CBN awards OPay for financial inclusion innovation. You can read that on page 25. And below the leading story by the right, 81-year-old treasurer of Okwama community dies in military custody. You can read that on page 7 of the newspaper. Alleged cyberbullying, why court denies Farotimi bail. You can read that on page 6 of the newspaper. Netizens on board mainstreams energy solution on closed carbon, Nigerian's carbon registry. You can read that on page 12 of the newspaper. NFF defies stakeholders protest, extends Sanusi's tenure for another 3 years. You can read that on page 30 of the newspaper. I'm moving over to the last paper, Business Day, the leading story. 11-year metering gap remains despite federal government's 335 billion naira handouts. And below the leading story by the right, Texas firms shut down, silences cotton production. You can read that on page 31 of the newspaper. Make your voices heard in your industries, women urged. You can read that also on page 36 of the newspaper. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper and read the complete story.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts on Facebook, Housing TV Africa, on Twitter, Housing TV Africa, Instagram, Housing TV Africa. Join the conversation and keep up with latest housing updates.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.